Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we're interviewing a wide variety of experts to look at every facet of the legends of Robin Hood, and in the process, we'll be questioning what we think we know about the legendary outlaw and the world from which his stories spring. While I have a deep and abiding love for the stories of Robin Hood, and the romantic notion of the rebellious hero who makes a stand against injustice and the oppressive yoke of a system built upon avarice, I also love science communication. For my day job, I'm fortunate enough to be the director of education for a science museum and planetarium, and getting to induce sparks of curiosity and help in my own small way to share our ever-broadening understanding of the universe is genuinely thrilling. As such, I'm always especially excited when I get to interview a scientist for the podcast. The guest for this episode is Naomi Sykes, the Lawrence Professor of Archaeology at the University of Exeter. Dr. Sykes specializes in zooarchaeology, and her research has broadened our understanding of the medieval world through studies centered on the interactions between humans and animals. Our discussion covers some of the fundamental ideas behind what can be learned through zooarchaeology, and gets into some details about medieval hunting practices, the difficulty in finding evidence for poaching, whether or not forest-dwelling outlaws would have had to keep an eye out for wolves, and a whole lot more. We even discuss a few of the ways in which zooarchaeology has changed my understanding of the medieval world. Now string your bow, draw your blade, and ready your trowel as we enter the Greenwood with archaeologist Dr. Naomi Sykes.
Hi there.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you. You?
I'm doing pretty well. I remember I was looking up and you had been at Nottingham at one point, but are you still there?
So right at this moment, I am in Nottinghamshire, but I don't work at the university anymore. I'm down at the University of Exeter now, which is about 200 miles south.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but still in that kind of general region.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining me here today. So what is your current title? You said you're at Exeter?
Yep, that's right. I am the Lawrence Professor of Archaeology in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Exeter.
Fantastic. And you specialize in zooarchaeology.
That's right. I'm a zooarchaeologist, which I think when I first heard the term, I thought it meant studying zoos, which actually I'm increasingly doing now as a zooarchaeologist. But what the term means is the study of ancient animals. So animal remains from archaeological sites. We recover animal bones. They're one of the most common finds that you get on archaeological sites. And we study them. I think initially people started looking at them so that they could find out about what people ate in the past, because most of the material that we get is actually food refuse. But increasingly, we've realized that we can look at these animals to get insights into what the animals might have been used for in life, whether it was for, in the case of sheep, for wool production, or cattle and horses for pulling plows or for riding. And then increasingly, we've moved away from just thinking about animals as these kind of resources, but also how we can look at animals to learn more about how people interacted with the world around them. So did they have pets? Did they go out hunting, or did they in fact avoid wild resources? So we can really start to understand human interactions with the natural world. We can also look at issues of trade. So quite a lot of the work that I've been doing, increasingly so, is looking at the spread of animals, people taking a particular species, whether it's chickens or cats or rabbits, from one part of the globe and moving them to another. So we can understand trade networks and then start to think about the motivations why people would do that. So why on earth would you be moving these animals? And sometimes with early transportations of animals, it's often about religion and religious beliefs. Quite a lot of animals are linked into early religions. So we can investigate all of these sorts of things, from diet to ideology, through the study of archaeological animal remains.
And I understand it can even include the animals that we're not intending to transport with us, rats and mice and other vermin that hitch rides but end up having remains that are left in human occupation sites. And that can still give us a lot of information about early trade routes when there aren't necessarily records being kept.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an increasing area of people's work. A guy called David Orton has got a big project looking at the spread of rats in the archaeological record to do exactly the things that you've suggested.
Mm-hmm. So I know that there are a number of techniques that get used to help gather this sort of information. Radiocarbon dating is done. A lot of standard dating practices are done referencing written texts and other records that would correspond with the time period when a site is being investigated. I've noticed that in a lot of your work, you also use isotope analysis. And I feel that's one of the techniques that people are only starting to kind of learn about now.
Sure. Yeah, both of those biomolecular techniques we do use very regularly. And also I would add into that genetics as well. So I tend to work with lots of different specialists, and we try to do something called full suite analysis. I say it is called full suite analysis. I think we might have made up that term ourselves, whereby you take a single specimen and you would look at it zooarchaeologically, you would measure it, you would see if it's got butchery marks on it, but then you might want to take a sample to check that it's the date that you think it is, because we're really learning that bones migrate up and down stratigraphies. So things that you find in a context that you think might be Roman turn out to be medieval or something like that. So we want to make sure that we know if it's an important specimen, that it really is the date that we think it is. So we use radiocarbon dating for that. We also, sometimes as a byproduct of radiocarbon dating, you get something called carbon and nitrogen isotope analyses results as well. And we do that more standardly without getting dates. And those isotope data tell us a bit about the diet of that animal. So carbon for Britain, let's stick with Britain, would tell us between terrestrial food sources and marine ecosystems where people are drawing their protein, or animals are drawing their protein from. And then the isotope analysis that we would do, this carbon and nitrogen, can tell us for Britain between marine and terrestrial ecosystems whether animals are drawing their food sources from either marine or terrestrial. The nitrogen analysis tells us how high up the trophic level an animal might be. So a vegetarian would be very low on the nitrogen. It would give us very low results. A carnivore would be very high up the scale. So that's one type of isotope analysis, or really two types of isotope analysis that we do. There are other kinds that can tell us about where animals might have come from and where they might have been transported, whether they lived locally or were being transported. So there are things called oxygen isotope analysis that is linked into temperature. We often do that on animal teeth, and that can tell us whether we've got, say, first generation imports from the Mediterranean. And then there's also strontium isotope analysis, which can tell us about whether an animal has come from the region that it ends up being deposited in, because it's linked into geology. So if you've got an animal that's linked, that is buried in a place and its teeth are consistent with the isotopes of the geology that it's buried in, then we could suggest that it's perhaps lived locally. But very often we get teeth with signatures that look as though they've come from a long, long way away. And when you combine the strontium with the oxygen data, it can tell us that things have moved from a very long distance, often Mediterranean to temperate zones, those sorts of things. In addition, as I said, we also do the genetic analysis. I'm not a geneticist at all, so I have to work with colleagues who really know about the genetics, but that is really useful about understanding population turnovers and being able to link a particular animal to a particular region. Sometimes you might have different populations of particular species in different areas. And sometimes we can then, if one arrives in Britain, we can work out whether it comes from Spain or whether it comes from Turkey, that sort of thing. So it's particularly useful for the medieval period for one species, which is the rabbit, all of these analyses, because rabbits are the archaeologist's nightmare because they burrow down through stratigraphy, and we never know whether the rabbits that we've got are of the context that they've been recovered from, or if they burrowed down and died yesterday. So we've been doing a big radiocarbon dating program to tease out the information about rabbits, and we're getting some quite good information about that from the radiocarbon dating and also from the genetics, but that's being prepared for publication now.
Yeah, I imagine the rabbits extra complicate things because there have been those periods of time in which they are being purposefully bred and raised as food sources and then introduced into new areas. And then when you're having this bioturbation, when you're having the rabbits burrowing into areas, I imagine it would make it a lot harder to try to narrow down when they're being introduced to that area or not, or whether they introduce themselves into an earlier time via their burrowing.
Yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. I mean, we started off and there were all of these claims of Mesolithic, so hunter-gatherer rabbits that were present in Britain, and we radiocarbon dated them, and they're like last week, they're really modern. So
that's really interesting. So there was a thought that there had been very early rabbits in Britain, and now that's being totally rethought.
Yeah, absolutely. That because you find them in context and people tend to just run with whatever they think looks okay. We have people suggesting that they're native, that they're a Bronze Age introduction, that they are introduced by the Romans, that they're introduced by the Normans, all of these different claims. And that's what we're working on to make sure we can really refine when rabbits were and when they weren't present in Britain.
Fantastic. To backtrack just a little bit to the isotope analysis. So for something like the oxygen or strontium isotope analysis, this is looking at isotopes, variations in elements that will have chemical signatures that are specific to a region, temperate based in the case of oxygen, geological based, so based on like the bedrock of an area where plants are being grown and then being consumed. Plants will have that same sort of signature based on the bedrock where they're being grown. And then that isotope will get into the teeth, correct, of the animals. Correct. And then you can find the teeth on the archaeological site, and you can cut out bits of the enamel because the enamel changes very little bit over time. So the food that you ate when you were a child will have the strontium of that area as opposed to the strontium of an area where you lived later in life. And
that's exactly right. Yeah, and it's the same with people. I mean, I could reach across and pluck a hair from your head and do analysis of that, and it would tell me everything about what you've been eating and where you've been, in the time that your hair grew. And we can do exactly the same thing for archaeological animal remains. So that's the principle is fundamentally you are what you eat and where you eat. And it all transfers through the food chain and becomes the building blocks of your body.
And what are you sampling for the nitrogen analysis? I know less about the nitrogen than the strontium.
So generally, we just take samples of bone. So any sample of bone will give us carbon and nitrogen results. So you can also do it for teeth, but generally most people do carbon and nitrogen analysis on bone samples. Okay. It's cheaper.
All right. And then that information would be more closely related to the animal's diet around the time that it died?
Yeah, so we can choose different body parts and it would give us a different snapshot. So again, with humans, because our bodies turn over at different times, I could take a sample of my rib and that would give me a certain time period, like the last 5 years. If I wanted a longer time period, I could take a sample from my femur, my leg bone, and that would give me a longer time frame because it takes longer for that part of your body to turn the bone over. And then if you really want those signatures from when you were growing up, you go to the teeth.
Interesting. Okay. I hadn't been aware of that with the bones and the different bones replacing at that kind of different rates. That's great. Although I suppose when it comes to archaeology, you're then often limited by what you actually find.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the big issues.
Yeah. So a lot of your particular research has been with animal populations in the UK in the medieval periods. I've noticed a lot of research that had to do with the Anglo-Saxon periods, Roman periods, and then high medieval, post-medieval, kind of quite a breadth of time there, really. And it's one of the things that I think is interesting, and part of the point of this whole podcast is that this is an area of time that we all feel like we know something about. Even people who don't live in England, we get exposed to things that have to do with English history all the time. It's, part of our cultural consciousness. It's part of our pop culture. I could go to Netflix and find half a dozen shows that take place somewhere between the Roman Britain period and the Renaissance, the Elizabethan period, what have you. They're just all over the place. But the images that we have of these times, it's important to remember that we're always reassessing these ideas and that we're always reevaluating them and we're always learning more about them. And that's sort of the crux of your research. And zooarchaeology is an important tool that helps us do that. So along those lines, I've been especially interested in your research with the fallow deer populations. So for our perhaps American listeners, could you tell us a little bit about what a fallow deer even is? Because when we think deer here in the US, we think of the local white-tailed deer populations that are all over the place and hunted very extensively.
Sure, they do look a bit like the white-tailed deer, sort of most of their body does, except they've got these big palmate antlers that look a bit more like moose, your moose, our elk, we call them. So what the fallow deer is, it's a species that was restricted after the last glacial maximum, which was about 20,000 years ago, where there was a big block of ice over most of northern Europe. A lot of animals in Europe retreated south, and fallow deer became restricted to the eastern Mediterranean. Today, they are everywhere around the world. So whilst you might not know them, there are fallow deer that have made it to the Americas. They're in fact in the Caribbean as well. There are populations. They're the national animal of Barbuda, for instance, which is something that I didn't know when I started this research. They're in New Zealand. They're in all sorts of places. And I became curious about how did that happen? Because they're native to this very small area in the Eastern Mediterranean, and yet they're around the world and no one knows how that happened. So the project that I had was to just answer those questions. When did they go global? How did that happen? Who was responsible? And most importantly, why? Because it seems really, really bizarre that you would take this wild deer species and translocate it around the world. So I had also been very interested in studying the Norman conquest. And it seemed as though the Normans may well be responsible for the spread of fallow deer. So that was one of the reasons that I started on this project, was really they're really very beautiful deer. And I wanted to understand how they'd traveled around the world and whether the Normans were all responsible for that.
One of the things that I was reading was that they were introduced into Britain before the Normans by the Romans, where they were held as like in very kind of small populations, I think, not introduced into the wild, and then went extinct in Britain sometime around the end of the Roman occupation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We're preparing this one for publication right now. It's very, very close. And I'm happy to talk about it. So what tends to happen is whenever a new animal arrives anywhere and you're trying to work out when it might have spread, you tend to attribute it to any invading culture. So the Vikings did it, the Romans did it, the Normans did it, or whatever. So we've been charting this and looking at all of the earliest evidence for fallow deer that we could find across Europe and actually around the world, and through time. So not just finding the earliest, but then seeing what happens next. And it is true that the Romans do look as though they were responsible for quite a big spread of fallow deer across the Roman Empire. There had been earlier moments when the deer were being spread. So I think actually from the Neolithic, so just as people start becoming farmers, they start moving fallow deer from the Eastern Mediterranean into the Mediterranean islands. So we see fallow deer popping up in Crete, on quite a lot of the islands off the coast of Turkey. You suddenly see fallow deer populations being established. And it looks as though the reasons that they were being spread is this religious association. Fallow deer are very much associated with the goddess Artemis, the Greek goddess Artemis, who can be traced back to Linear B texts, like Bronze Age cultures, Knossos and all of that, where there are mentions of Artemis, and fallow deer also turn up. So I think there is this link between Artemis and fallow deer, which then in the Roman incarnation of Artemis, which is Diana, I think that association continues. And that's another reason why fallow deer get spread across all of the Roman Empire. And they do make it into Britain. We've got very clear evidence that fallow deer arrive at a site called Fishbourne Roman Palace. It's this incredible palatial structure. It's the largest domestic building from the Roman period north of the Alps. And we did find fallow deer remains there, including jaws and teeth, and did all of the isotope analyses that we've talked about, and were able to identify that there was in fact a first generation import. So a deer that had been born in the Mediterranean and transported very quickly within the first few months of life to Britain, where it then lived out the rest of its life. And we then know, because we've done radiocarbon dating, that this was the earliest specimen that we had, this first generation import. But then we had other deer that were later that had been both born and bred at Fishbourne. So a little population was established. And then we can also chart that different populations get taken to different places in Britain. So it looks like there's one introduction that then results in a few more introductions across southern Britain. But you're quite right. Once the Romans go away, those deer all go extinct, and not just in Britain. They had made it to Northern Europe in general, on the continent. They all go extinct as well. And it's only the ones in Italy, Iberia, where those populations have endured to the present. Everywhere else, those deer go extinct. And it's not until the medieval period that fallow deer are reintroduced to Northern Europe, starting in Britain. The debate was then, okay, who is responsible for introducing them? Well, if it was the Romans first time, it's got to be the Normans, right? Who are responsible for this second introduction. And that's where the results started to reveal that everything we thought we knew, and the received wisdom, and all of my publications up until 2010 were wrong, because it turns out that it really isn't the Normans who are responsible for this second introduction. The radiocarbon dates show that this is a pre-Norman conquest introduction. I had written that it was the Normans, that they had introduced fallow deer from medieval Sicily. No, that's wrong as well, because the genetic results show that the deer that were in medieval Sicily are a very different population to the ones that make it to Britain. So the ones that arrive in Britain are coming probably from the Byzantine world, the Eastern Roman Empire, before the Normans are arriving. So already starting to change our perspective of how things happened with fallow deer.
Okay. So then during that kind of late Anglo-Saxon period through like trade with the Byzantine Empire, then it seems likely?
Yeah, I think so. When I first got these results, because we actually found this out quite a long time ago, and we just haven't gotten around to pulling all of the data, because when you're doing that full suite analysis, there are a lot of strands of data that you've got to integrate. So when I first found this result, and it seemed to suggest that we had pre-Norman deer and that they seemed to be coming from Turkey. I reached out to a lot of my colleagues going like, oh, it looks like there's these trade networks. And I was shot down by my colleagues who were like, no, there's no trade like between at this period. And then I realized that what they were talking about in terms of trade was your kind of standard trade routes of like grain or cloth or something like that. But what there was is elite exchange. So very high status objects, ivories, gold, silks, and fallow deer, I think, were being moved and probably taken by people who themselves were moving between these different areas. There was a lot of traveling between the Byzantine world and Britain in that period. The Vikings as well, were moving things around.
Yeah, that's true. They were certainly known for their pretty extensive trade networks. But that actually does get to a point that I wanted to bring up. So in so many of the Robin Hood stories, there, and really it's a concept that is introduced much later, post-medieval, coming out of Sir Walter Scott, but like this emphasis on the Normans versus the Saxons. And it often gets presented in our modern pop culture that chooses to embrace this storyline about how there was this kind of more egalitarian Saxon society, and the Normans came and invaded, and they, took over all of these positions of power. And there is some truth to that notion that the elite portions of society were subsumed by these Norman invaders. But then like Robin Hood is representing this more egalitarian Saxon past with this redistribution of wealth that he engages in, and that was the like proper Saxon way of life. But I noticed in some of your work, you're challenging that idea that in the late Saxon period, the period right before the conquest, that there was necessarily a very egalitarian society, and that you did have this very elite structure that may have been engaging in this sort of trade with Byzantium. And I noticed in particular, I think it was in a chapter you wrote for the Oxford Book of Anglo-Saxon Archaeology about the late Saxon elites privatizing venison.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Let's go back to the point about, the pre-conquest period being egalitarian, and I think it's all relative, right? So if we go all the way back to the immediate post-Roman period and the few sort of centuries after the Romans, it does look as though we've got a situation where there is a lot of redistribution of wealth, and that's actually how leaders were kind of maintaining loyalty. So with the halls that we hear about in Beowulf and other sort of 7th through 9th, perhaps, century societies, we see that, I would say, the whole of culture in Britain at this time, or let's say the island of Britain, is maintained and structured around kind of this concept of cutting up, whether it's land or food or all of these things, and redistribution. And that's how society is ordered. By the time we get into the sort of 10th or late 9th, 10th century, things are changing in the way that society is working. So whereas before, land was kind of recycled, it was cut up and gifted to people, but then kind of returned after a generation or so. When we move into this later period, land is gifted on a permanent basis, and land is power. And as soon as you start to see land rights changing, I think you see power structures changing. When people own things, they often want to kind of then hunt on them as a demonstration of what they own. And I think there's, if land is power, land and power can be demonstrated through hunting. So we do start to see this kind of upkick into that pre-conquest period where elite identities are being performed through hunting, and that it is a change from what we'd seen in the preceding periods. But as I said, everything is relative. And I think the Norman conquest still does create a complete transformation. So zooarchaeologically, I can look at animal bone assemblages and see how well represented wild animals are. And in that post-Roman period, they're not well represented at all. On most sites, you're going to get maybe 0% wild animals to maybe 1.5% wild animals. And when you move into the pre-Norman period, there is an increase, particularly on high status sites. But it's only to perhaps, 4% maximum on your high status sites. When we go to the post-Norman period, so after the Norman conquest, or it changes, suddenly we're looking at wild animal representation on elite sites, it can be up to 20%. So if we're saying that wild animals equal power and land, this is telling us something about societal change. So there's something in the idea that there is real elite identities and disparity in wealth in the post-conquest period. But it was trending that way anyway. But I think 1066 plays a major role in transforming what happens.
So about that idea of hunting as a way of kind of displaying wealth and power, it's often presented as this idea of the hunt that leads to the great feasts and all, but that's not really the most efficient way in order to have large helpings of meat at your table. If you're living in a society in which pastoralism exists and you've got livestock, the more cost-effective way is to butcher animals that are being raised as opposed to having to hunt them. One of the things that came out in an interview earlier where I tagged along on a deer hunt was the hunter was talking about how this is his hobby. Yes, his family gets food that they eat and they enjoy, but it's not a cost-effective way.
No, absolutely not.
Because he enjoys it.
Yeah, I would say that hunting is probably the least efficient way of latching onto protein, right? It's a colleague who I work with very closely. He's an anthropologist and works a lot on hunting. And he says that, hunting is a social and political performance. And it needs to be understood in those sorts of terms rather than as just, an efficient way of catching meat. It isn't. It's all about politics. And in the case of the medieval period and the Normans in particular, it's about legitimizing their power over the conquered population.
And we have so much in our imaginations, the idea of hunting taking place with bow and arrow. And, you mentioned Artemis and Diana, and she's associated with bows and hunting. And then, of course, we have Robin Hood, who is, of course, very well known for hunting deer with a bow. But that's not necessarily what hunting was looking like for these late Anglo-Saxon, early Norman elite individuals.
Yeah, that's correct. So you're right. In the Roman period, we do have very clear evidence that people are using bows and arrows, and that is how hunting is taking place. Or there are a few other tools. Really, hunting equipment reflects whatever your sort of warfare equipment is. And what we know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is that, and from other writers, is that the pre-conquest folk of Britain didn't really use bows and arrows. And that is reflected in the archaeological record, where we have very little evidence for any kind of bows and arrows until we get to the Norman period. And in fact, even in iconography, I think I only managed to find one representation of a bow and arrow in pre-conquest texts, but then they're everywhere. I mean, look at the Bayeux Tapestry. It's just full of archers on the Norman side. And so what was happening before the conquest is more that I think we're seeing deer being driven into nets and then killed with spears and swords, those sorts of things. Maybe for the earlier, the sort of post-Roman periods, we've got the seaxes. So these look to be sort of ceremonial swords. It's where the Saxons get their names from, is these seaxes. I think those were used quite a lot in hunting. Then more spears, swords into the pre-Norman period. And then, yes, after the Normans, we do see a shift towards bows and arrows. And that enables a very different kind of hunt. And I think that's one of the things that we see happening. So although we know that we've got fallow deer in the pre-Norman period, they're very, very rare. They're only on a few sites. And I think we need to see those deer more as exotica, kept in menageries more than anything else. The deer that most people were hunting before the Norman conquest is the roe deer, which is a very small little deer, but you can drive it into nets and catch it. After the Norman conquest, the deer that we see people focusing on is the red deer. That's your elk, I think, are the red deer. And we see suddenly they become the best represented deer in high status assemblages. And intriguingly, that's what we see in France as well. Red deer are the dominant deer that is hunted in 11th, 12th century France. And it feels as though that this is a cultural form of hunting that has come across in the Norman period, or with the Normans. And because you can hunt red deer in a different way, they've got great stamina. You can chase them for up to 20 miles and single out a particular deer. I think it was a really good way of the Normans to kind of charge across what they considered to be their land and demonstrate to everyone that it was their land. And that's what forest law is about. I think when we think about forest law, we tend to think about woodland and forest, but actually forest law is a legal concept. Pretty much most of Britain was not wooded by the time that the Normans arrived. Forest law was just a legal term that meant that the Normans were allowed to go hunting on everybody else's land. So as a statement of superiority, of dominance, hunting over your conquered populations, farmland, fields, it's a real statement that you are in charge now, and look at you.
We have this notion of Sherwood Forest as representing this forested, wooded, somewhat primeval greenwood area that Robin Hood and his outlaws live in and all, but really Sherwood Forest was a very large area of land that included pastures and towns, and was, like you said, a legal marcation of territory in which this forest law was applied. And some of it contained woods, but it is not as though all of that area was just dense woodland.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in that area, we're seeing a lot of these strict forest laws. We're seeing this restriction on hunting and this very severe privatization. And this is occurring post-Norman invasion, especially I think after the reign of Henry II. And what is happening with the deer population around that time?
So it's difficult to work out exactly what's going on with deer populations based on zooarchaeological evidence. You can apply genetic techniques to try and model populations based on samples, but we haven't done that. What we can say is that deer bones become incredibly well represented in these post-Norman conquest assemblages on high status sites, but they do drop on lower status sites, which would seem to suggest that forest law is dissuading people, your standard peasants, from going out hunting because they might fear being caught. And we can come back to some examples I've got where I think we've got some nice evidence of poaching. But in terms of deer populations, let's think about what's happened. The Normans have introduced fallow deer. They're clearly farming them within parks, and we can see in the landscape a sort of rash of parks spreads across Britain as everyone's trying to maintain fallow deer and really farm them. People are so concerned about deer numbers because, venison becomes the social currency. It's kind of binding communities together, because as much as meat redistribution wasn't then happening as a standard practice, it was still happening with venison. So again, courts and lords would keep their people together by distributing bits of venison to different kinds of people as a sort of statement that we're all in this together. So there's a hierarchy, but you're part of something. So because venison becomes so important, people are actively trying to encourage deer populations up, and they want to get rid of any natural predators. So I would say, it's difficult to know when wolves go extinct, when bears go extinct, when the lynx goes extinct. But I think we can be fairly confident that in the medieval period, if there are any predators around, they're being taken out just to preserve these deer populations. So I think we can be confident that they're pretty high into the medieval period. To what extent that lasts, because if you stop managing and just keep hunting deer, they will go extinct. Yeah, so a colleague of mine was studying the genetics of roe deer populations. So looked at the zooarchaeological evidence, but also took samples of roe deer and was able to do those techniques that I mentioned, where you kind of model on the basis of the genetics tied into radiocarbon dates what the population did. And it does look as though by the 12th century, maybe into the 14th, that roe deer were pretty much extinct in England at least, and perhaps only populations were surviving in the north. So it looks as though without careful management, it was possible for medieval hunters to do real damage to deer populations.
Would that be part of the poaching evidence that you were talking about?
So no, the poaching evidence is always difficult to be able to claim that you've got poaching evidence. But I've got a couple of examples which kind of came about by mistake. We were trying to do the full suite analysis on our fallow deer, and we'd been given some samples from a few Roman sites where there were like complete articulated legs of fallow deer. And when we did the genetic analysis, my colleague, the same one, Karis Baker, who did the roe deer work, came to me going like, this doesn't look like these are Roman deer. They're completely different to all of the other Roman deer that we've got. And I'm like, no, they've got to be Roman because they were on Roman sites. There's no evidence of any medieval occupation. They've got to be, there's nothing else there. And she's like, okay, well, let's get them dated, but I don't believe it. And she was absolutely right. They came back as being sort of 12th through to 14th century. These fallow deer that are, their remains are in the middle of nowhere. They've been kind of butchered and quickly thrown into pits. It's as though, I think this is evidence of poaching, where people have been out, they've killed something, they don't want to be caught with it, so they butchered it in the field, got the meat, hidden the evidence, and gone back home with the meat. So that's a paper that we haven't even started writing, but I think it's really, really exciting that we've got this evidence of potential poaching. And there are a few other sites that we don't have the genetics and dating for, but it looks as though there's good evidence for poaching there too.
That's one of the elements that gets left out of the stories pretty frequently. If you poach this deer, well, it so often gets presented as in the movies, in particular, of the hunter being caught red-handed as they're poaching the deer. Aha, these foresters or Sir Guy of Gisborne just happens to be riding by while the deer is being shot, and that's how they catch the poacher. But if you've just shot a deer, you've got a large carcass to try to deal with, and that is evidence of illegal activity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that doesn't get discussed very much, and so that's an interesting idea. Just finding these old pits that had previously been Roman sites and just trying to ditch your bones there. That makes sense. I'm curious to see what comes of that line of research. You mentioned very briefly the lynx, the bear, and the wolf. And so these are all animals that we know used to live in Britain. And we know basically that they went extinct at some point in the Middle Ages, but it's hard to pin down when, because these aren't like animals that are being farmed. They're not animals that are being hunted for food. So there's not going to be a lot of evidence that can be found on archaeological sites.
Yeah, that's one of the problems with the lynx and the bear. I think we've got colleagues who have been working on these species, and it looks as though those two species are probably extinct 9th, 10th century. The issue then is the wolves, because if you look at historical evidence, there are lots of claims that there are wolves all over the place. I mean, in Ireland, for instance, they called it, the Wolf Island, because there are claims that there are wolves everywhere in Ireland. But intriguingly, I work with colleagues in Ireland. They can find no zooarchaeological evidence for any wolves. And in Britain, there's really not much evidence either. Now, is it for the reasons that you say, that they're just unlikely to turn up on archaeological sites? Or is it possibly that they're already extinct? Because I think when we read historical texts and they're referring to particular kinds of animals, I think we kind of project onto those texts what we think a wolf is and whatever. I'm not sure that our understanding of natural history is the same as people in the medieval period's understanding of animals. And I think the analogy that I like is, Babe, that film about the pig, the little talking pig. When the sheep that he hangs out with see dogs, they call them wolves. And I think we've also forgotten how terrifying semi-feral dogs might be, because they don't exist in Britain, they don't exist in America, but they do exist in other parts of the world, and they are scary. They're not your pet dogs, they are scary, angry dogs. And I think it's very likely that the wolves that we see referred to in a lot of historical texts are actually just feral, mad dogs that probably are attacking livestock and things like that. So I do have a student who's just about to start their PhD tackling this very issue. And so we've been pulling together all of the wolf remains that we can find. And really the last good evidence that I've got for the presence of wolves is the Roman period, where we do, the jaws are massive. And we can use all those same isotope techniques to work out whether these are animals that are living locally or potentially have been imported as body parts, because wolf skins were traded quite a lot. So we'll look into all of this and do a real deep dive into the zooarchaeological evidence, combine it with genetics, so that we can answer this question of whether there were a lot of wolves in the medieval period or whether they had gone extinct earlier. I think regardless, if we've got angry feral dogs, they will be performing the function of wolves. So they would still be chasing deer and eating deer. So I think that we still have that threat to the deer population. So there would probably have been things that were being managed and taken control of. And that's why we see these references to wolf killers in the medieval period.
Okay, that would make sense why a term like wolf's head might still get applied. That's one of those phrases that comes up, and becomes a synonym for an outlaw, as the wolf's head. Mm-hmm. But if you're getting paid to hunt wolves because they're a danger, but as you say, that could also be hunting wild dogs.
Yeah, because if wolves did go extinct in the Roman period, then no one would know what a wolf looked like anyway. You would just hear rumors from Scandinavia or from the continent about what wolves are, and wolves are these big, scary dogs. So I think it would be easy to kind of make that association.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of upending of expectations that occurs through the archaeological research, and that's good. That's what we want with our research, is to help us get new understanding. There was a paper that came out last year that made a big splash. I saw it being reported in a number of places, and I think you at least contributed it in some way, In Search of the Great Horse.
Oh yeah, I contributed to that one a wee bit.
Yeah, what was your involvement with that paper?
So I'm on the steering committee of the project, and my colleagues asked me to just go through and read through the paper, and I made some suggestions about how things might be improved. And yeah.
Yeah, and so my understanding of the crux of that paper is it's searching for evidence of just what a war horse in the medieval period was, and what they would have looked like. Sure. As far as my reference to upending expectations, there is this kind of built-in notion that I see put forth all the time, that knights in the medieval period were riding around on these great, big, massive war horses. And of course, the horses had to be huge to accommodate, these full-grown men in full armor. But this is a difficult thing to really actually sort out, because what exactly is a war horse is hard to narrow down, because you could have the horses that a knight might charge into battle with, but you'd also have lighter horses that they're riding great distances on. And size does not necessarily strictly correlate to strength.
Absolutely.
Could you speak a little bit to some of the findings, at least thus far with the project? I know it's still ongoing because there's a sort of difficulty in finding a lot of good evidence.
Yeah, I think that is the issue with the project. In that it is difficult. How do you know that you've got a war horse when you find some bones in the archaeological record? You would have to have it from a grave that says I was a war horse to be pretty confident that you've got a war horse. It does look as though they might have found some of those, and they've been working on some cemeteries, some horse cemeteries in London where they're later medieval, and some of those horses are really quite large, and it's quite interesting. If we go back though, I think the thing that I find really interesting is that, again, I've used this phrase already today, it's all relative, right? So you've talked about, we would need to have giant horses to be able to accommodate giant men on in their armor. Well, what we need to do is think about how big were people at that time. And people weren't that big. So it's all relative. I think what we would need to see is the size of horses relative to the size of people, and then make a decision about whether these horses are big or small. Because I think a horse that might appear small to someone who is 6'2" might feel very big to someone who's 5'2", So I think that's the sort of work that needs to be done. So even though it does look as though a lot of these medieval horses are really quite small in relative terms, I don't, as you say, size doesn't always equate to power. And a lot of the Danish horses, which we know were very powerful, very fast, were also very, very small. So I think we need to just get out of our headspace of just taking modern metrics and going, this is big, this is small. It's all got to be considered in relative terms.
And we don't necessarily have people riding around in full suits of plate mail either. That's a much later. Definitely jumped on by Hollywood, but also jumped on by the kind of Tudor period, late medieval, post-medieval period, but not so much what we're seeing around the time of the Norman invasion or post around the time of Richard the Lionheart. Fantastic. That's exciting. I'm glad to hear that there's still a lot of really interesting research to come out. I look forward to hearing more. Before I let you go, because the podcast does use Robin Hood as our central figure to ask our various questions, I feel I would be remiss without asking if you have any particular associations with Robin Hood, any favorite adaptations that you've grown up with or have a fondness for?
That's a fun question. So I've just come back from field work, and bizarrely, I was traveling back one day on the coach, sat next to one of my students, and for some reason, we started talking about the Robin Hood, the Disney version of Robin Hood. And I was like, oh, wow, actually, yeah, that was really fun. And then I started, this popped into my head. And it's like, it's the beginning of that. And I don't know how it's so embedded in my head, but I guess that one's got to be my favorite rendition of Robin Hood with all the crazy animals dressed. Oh, it's a fox, right? Robin Hood the fox.
Yep,
so maybe even as a child, I was drawn to animal versions of events. So I'll go with that one.
That's a good one. I think I've been thinking about that movie a lot. It's going to come up fairly soon on my kind of rotation of watching every single Robin Hood movie in chronological order. And a claim that I think I feel comfortable making is that when it comes down to total popular appeal, that is the most popular version of Robin Hood that exists.
Well, that little whistling tune is going to be earworming with me all day now that I've just got it back in my head. So yeah, it's great.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. It's, I think, a really good way of trying to showcase the sort of breadth of different things that can be learned by examining the zooarchaeological record, and showcases how we're applying a variety of techniques and continuing to just keep learning more about this period. That it's something that is in the past, but our knowledge of it continues to expand.
But it was a huge thrill to be able to talk to you about this and share some of the work that we've been doing. So thank you ever so much.
my thanks again to Naomi Sykes for joining me in the Greenwood to discuss her research. One of the things you may have noticed during the interview was how Dr. Sykes often talked about ongoing research projects and about various challenges that have come up to previously held notions. And that's one of the fundamental aspects of science to understand. It's an ongoing process of discovery. Even though the past has, by definition, already occurred, our understanding of our own history and the world that we have inherited will never be perfect. Historians and archaeologists are the detectives attempting to seek out and understand the clues hidden in everything from old legal documents to the microscopic particles in our bones. But there will never be a denouement where the truth is laid bare in a parlor room. There will always be more to study. And while the great mystery that we simply call the past can never be completely solved, those informative clues are out there, and I'm grateful for the scientists who find them. As of the time of this recording, 2 of the pivotal papers discussed in the interview that relate to some of those ongoing research projects, one on fallow deer populations and the one on medieval great horses, are available for open access, and I will include links to them in the show description. If you'd like to share some of your thoughts about the mysterious medieval past and the ongoing efforts to understand it, then feel free to get in touch via Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, where we use the handle @IntoGreenwood. If you wouldn't touch social media with a cloth-yard shaft, you can also email us directly via intogreenwood@gmail.com. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3, and it's brought to you by the generous support of our patrons on patreon.com/IntoGreenwood. If you'd like to join our merry band on Patreon, you can support the podcast for as little as $1 an episode. Not only will you be helping us cover our hosting fees, but you'll also get access to backer-exclusive content, such as bonus audio and an exclusive Into the Greenwood t-shirt. The most recent bonus audio involves my Splitting Arrows contributor, Rick, and I embarking on the task of ranking every silver screen portrayal of Robin Hood. The next bit of bonus audio will be a look at literature's most consistent love interest for Little John. All money from the Patreon goes directly to paying for the hosting fees and production costs, except for 10% that we set aside for our select charity of Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated foundation that implements sustainable solutions for providing clean water and food to impoverished communities around the world. If you have not alms with which to support this small podcast, you would also be doing us an immense help by leaving a positive rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you listen to us. Into the Greenwood is really lacking in reviews, which means the Podfinder algorithms aren't likely to recommend us to potential new listeners. And of course, recommending the podcast yourself to others would mean a lot as well. Into the Greenwood is completely independent and ad-free, but we do need some assistance to stay that way. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together, into the Greenwood.